Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Iron Culture, presented by Mass. I am Eric Trexler. I'm joined tonight by the good Dr. Eric Helms, and the real question tonight is going to be, does Eric remember all the buttons? Will Eric accidentally delete this? What kind of technical mishaps may occur? Because frankly, we haven't been live in like a while. It's been like almost a month, maybe 3 episodes in a row that were pre-recorded. And truth be told, I prefer the live ones for a variety of reasons, a multitude. First of all, I love engaging with the good people. There's enough bad people in my life. I want to get online on YouTube and engage with the good ones who are in either on the Mass YouTube channel or the Iron Culture YouTube channel in the live chat. So I'm finally interacting with good people, not the flawed people who are around me all day, every day in my life. Okay. On top of that, it's easier. The editing is not as strenuous. The editing, the prep work, etc. So all of that is to say, I am in my sweet spot right now. I'm glad to be here with you. How's life going?
I'm good, man, and I'm glad this is easy street for you. You're good on your feet. We're here with the good people of Office Hours as well as Iron Culture presented by Mass, and I'm looking forward to us seeing one another in person. We're just a couple of weeks out from the SNA annual conference where we're all going to be meeting up in Austin, and you can still attend, folks. And there also is an online option. I realize that we have all these folks watching us live on YouTube. If you check out the Sports Nutrition Association conference online, there is an online option where you can watch. So, hey, if you can see us in person, amazing. If not, I think there's still a lot you can get from watching online. But I'm good, Trex. I can't complain.
Yeah, that is a good point. We've been pushing the Austin conference because we want to see the people out there live and in the flesh. But there is an online option. So if you can remind me, I will put in the show notes when this is all over and said and done, how people can capitalize on that electronic digital attendance option. Now, there's nothing we can do about sending you Mexican food or the delicious barbecue that you're going to find in Austin. We cannot digitally help you party on 6th Street as the young people do. I think they still do that, and I think it's 6th Street, but we'll see. There's a lot of things you'll be missing out on. You won't see the bats, okay? And the bats are always, a huge draw. But nonetheless, if you want to see fitness, science, etc., then you can at least get that digitally. All right. Before we get into the questions tonight, if you like the show by chance and you'd like to support it, there's many ways to do that. Make sure you like, rate, subscribe, review, all that kind of stuff. Make sure you tell a friend, share the links, get people involved if they might like it, or if they want to hate watch it, which is, people do that too. So either way, it supports us just the same. Of course, if you really want to show your support and reach the gold tier of supporter, we need to put up a plaque or something where, now that I actually work on a physical campus again, you go up to like a wall and it's like, oh, here's our gold tier supporters who all donated like $200,000. If you want to be a gold tier supporter, the way to do that is you join the Mass community. The Mass Research Review, we put it out the first of the month, every single month. It just went out. Actually, we usually put it out a day early. We've never, ever, ever been late in the history of Mass, which has been going since 2017. We already put out the issue for April 1st. We put it out was it early today, I think? We usually put it out early the day before the new month. So that's out there. It is an absolutely killer issue. So much in store for the good people. Written articles, videos, audio summaries, you name it, we got it. And Helms, actually, the first question that I want to throw at you, this came from the After Hours question submission portal, a little ditty about hydration. And this month you wrote a little bit about hydration in the Mass Research Review, so I figured, what a wonderful serendipitous question. So, the question comes from a person whose name, allegedly, is Dolphin. And they said, can you talk about the possibility of overhydration, like drinking too much water It's a habit, and I'm not sure if it could be the cause of my lethargy and brain fog. First of all, I just want to say it could be the fact that you're living in the ocean despite being a mammal.
That'll do it.
That is a way to interact with water way more than any mammal should. And so to you and all dolphins, I would suggest maybe not doing the whole water thing anymore in terms of where you spend your day. But for the more technical elements, I'm going to kick it over to the good Dr. Helms.
No, I think that was a very purposeful response to that question. To give you a little more background on hydration, we've got our typical kind of like fitness evidence-based meme responses to this. Like, did you know even a 2% loss in body mass can result in a decrease in performance? That's actually true, and there is data on that, reasonably robust data. It is actually specific to aerobic performance. And then if you look at strength performance, there's actually a lot less data, but the data that exists is there, and it's still mounting. And it's probably a slightly larger amount of losses of body mass before you see a decrement in performance, probably to the tune of like 3%. And there's been some specific studies on stuff like, the mass audience would care about, or the iron culture audience would care about, like bench press performance. The good news, and this is something that a lot of powerlifters know, that if you actually restore that body mass loss, there's probably a time component that performance will come back. So that is why there's typically, you only want to cut so much if you're a powerlifter or a weightlifter for performance. And the typical response that I get when I start talking about hydration to more dedicated lifters is, yeah, that's great, but what fool would go into the gym dehydrated? And that's not something I need to worry about, right? And I'm not one to be like an alarmist, but I think people would be pretty surprised at the research that's been done, where very simple studies, by the way, they just take urine-specific gravity, which is a portable measure, and you're just looking at urine in a kind of little kaleidoscope thing, and you can get a measurement of hydration status, and you can tell if someone has met the threshold for what we would consider dehydrated via USG. It's a pretty easy measure to do. And there's been these studies where they've just gone to gyms in different places and simply looked at how many people are entering the gym to do a training session and they're actually dehydrated. And these numbers actually shocked me. There was one particular study that I liked where they had, I believe it was a gym in Boston and a gym in LA, and they recruited like over 150 people from each one.
Wait a minute.
Go, sorry. You go ahead.
Who were the authors and when was this published?
Are you trying to figure out if you were actually one of the people who...
No, I'm cooking. I got my gears turning. Do you have that information here?
Yeah, it's Peacock and colleagues. And it was published, I think the timing is going to make it not quite fit for you. It was 2011. Yeah, Peacock, Stokes, and Thompson. Initial hydration status, fluid balance.
No, I was curious because the that like classic fat-free mass index steroid paper from 1995, they also had that almost exact same sample size at commercial gyms in Boston and LA. And I was like, wait a minute, are these linked? But I don't think that works with the authorship. So, sorry.
So there's actually two. So there's the 2011 one by Peacock, Stokes, and Thompson. And this was 52 participants. Apologies. I'm actually going to have to probably edit the article. It's already gone to PDF, and I have them swapped. It doesn't matter. This is a minor detail. But then there's also Stover and colleagues, 2006. And this one is the one that I think it has a larger sample size, and it was in two different locations. So they had 166 people in Chicago and 163 people in Los Angeles. And the reason why that's relevant is very different climates, humidity as well as temperature at the time of the data collection. And get this, Trex, out of those over 300 people, there were no significant differences, I should say, between the two locations, which is surprising. And B, while it wasn't a majority of participants, 46% of the exercisers, based upon USG, were clocking a dehydrated status as they were going into their workout.
Yeah.
So it is actually quite common, and I would guess many of them maybe would have not predicted that they're dehydrated based upon their subjective thirst or experience at the time.
Yeah, Helms, have you ever been? So I've never done this for a study myself. I've never needed to, but I've, had colleagues who, like a member on their thesis committee said, "Oh, by the way, you should make sure everybody's hydrated before they do their testing sessions." And so people come in for a study that's really not all that related to hydrate, or not directly, like that's not the research question, but they say, go ahead and get urine specific gravity for everybody that comes in. And if they're not hydrated, get them hydrated or send them home. And so I would have been surprised by that number if not seeing graduate students almost literally pulling their hair out, saying none of my subjects show up hydrated and I cannot actually test them and I am not going to graduate and my life is over. Um, Cut to the end, their lives weren't over. They did graduate, but it was still not pleasant, not stressful, and a very real indicator that, like, yeah, a lot of people, you tell them, hey, show up hydrated, feeling good, ready to exercise, and they are I wouldn't say clinically, they are detectably, measurably underhydrated.
Yeah. And I think it's more common to happen in the morning, just because you're kind of starting on the back foot. You're behind the eight ball, if you will. You have to kind of make up for the fact that unless you're over the age of 40, which I can attest to, you sleep through the night, and that's 8 hours at least, hopefully, where you're not drinking any fluids. And even when I wake in the middle of the night, I'm not going to actually sit there and drink water, even though many people do. I'm just like, I'm going to pee and I'm going to fall right back to sleep because I don't want to spend any time thinking. So, yeah, you might notice.
Keep us updated on that, by the way. I'd be interested, as your prostate starts to change with age, let us know. I want to know about your nocturnal urination habits.
No, we can do that. We can have just a Helms aging update in general.
Yeah.
Specific to my
the wheels are going to start falling off soon, so we're going to want to do that weekly. Yeah.
Yeah. What you really want to see is, when do I start to forget to do it? And that's when we know the cognitive decline has really kicked in.
Yeah.
So when you have to remind me, or when I give you an update and then like 5 seconds later I start the update again, now we're really doing bad.
Yeah.
But actually, no, I've had some experience with this myself, largely being drug tested. So when you get urine tested in powerlifting competitions, this is where I can specifically remember it happened. They can also tell you, by the way, you're kind of dehydrated. So and that's pretty common when people are making weight as well. So yeah, this study, I think, gives an indication that perhaps a lot more of us are dehydrated than we think we are, especially if you're coming off of work where you're focused, you're not thinking about it, and then you're like, oh, shit, I got to go, and you go directly to the gym. So why does this matter? For one, it can absolutely harm performance, as I talked about in the start, and that can potentially result in poor adaptations over time. I think that's a reasonable conclusion, even though I don't know of any studies that have looked at chronic dehydration on the actual adaptations to training. But if you want to read a lot about this, by the way, in the current Mass article that just came out, as I mentioned, there's a minor typo in the reference list, but it's probably inconsequential in the grand scheme. I did write about this. The reason I wrote about it is I do have reason to believe that beyond just impacting performance, there may be an impact on actual muscular adaptation tracks. And that's because when you train, we've all experienced this, you get an increase in muscle size acutely. And that is what we often describe as the pump. And what's actually going on there is that there is a shift in your fluid compartments in your body, and it increases intramuscular fluid retention. And intramuscular fluid retention increases are associated at least with short-term anabolic and anti-catabolic markers. Muscle cell swelling, things like this. If you were to look at some of the speculative hypothesis papers on how does metabolic stress potentially impact hypertrophy, why does BFR work, etc., and what are some of the cascades in response to resistance training, there's at least plausible contributing factors that come from that increase in intramuscular hydration. You can even read about creatine, how that might be doing something as well. So it's a good thing that we get the pump. And the research that I reviewed suggested, okay, well, what happens if you try to get a pump, or if you go into the gym and you're dehydrated? And to give long story short, you still get the pump response, but you start from a lower level, and it only gets to a certain amount. And you and I both Trex, we've been backstage at bodybuilding shows. How many times do you hear about the competitors who probably cut water or did something weird with their electrolytes, and they're talking about how they just can't catch a pump? And of course, their brain's going to, well, hey, I didn't carb up enough. And I'm like, I know you want that to be the case because you would love to eat more carbs. And of course, every bodybuilder says you look better if you cut water. But it's probably not the carbohydrates as to why you can't catch a pump, my man.
Yeah, no, I've been in those situations backstage, and yeah, everyone's like, I've been thirsty for 3 days. I haven't seen sodium in a week, but I just don't understand why I can't get this pump. And they're thinking maybe more honey is gonna do it.
Honey for the veins. I remember being told that by a judge and told I don't need to get any leaner. I just need to cut up the muscle I have and take honey for the veins.
So don't get leaner, but cut up.
Correct. Cut up the muscle I have, which they suggested high reps, cutting water, and taking honey. Needless to say, I ignored them.
You say taking honey as if it's you need a prescription for that.
You do, yeah. It was a natural bodybuilding show too, so it was a pretty sketchy advice. But yeah, so I needless to say, I ignored them, got leaner, and then I got into my first overall in the next competition. But nonetheless, listen to what judges say about what you look like, but not what to do about it. Let's just put that there. So anyway, there is reason to believe that hydration could impact adaptations, both on the performance side of it and that having a long-term effect if you're one of these people who's chronically underhydrated. And there's also reason to believe that maybe there's a mechanistic rationale where it could make the adaptations poorer, independent of the actual volume of training or loads you can lift. So the specific question we got, though, is, well, can you overdo it? And technically, no, but I would say pedantically, just because the answer is no, there are negative impacts of having too much fluids. So people have probably heard the term hyponatremia, which just means that you have washed out your electrolytes because your water turnover is so high and you can't urinate or sweat without losing some salt. So hyponatremia, Na, salt, it's basically when you are consuming so much fluid that water turnover is so high that you get to this state where your sodium levels get very low. And it can dysregulate also your sensation of thirst and kind of create a bit of a runaway effect. And when you combine that with heat, you can get some pretty serious issues. And this is one of the reasons why it is arguably safer in some cases to have electrolyte-based drinks, especially for endurance athletes in the heat. This is something I only know of reading and being involved with. I am absolutely outside of book knowledge. I have no experience with this. So Trex, I don't know, you have done some endurance training yourself and lived in hotter climates than I have. Is this something you've ever worried about or seen on your own?
Not really. And I even back when I was at Ohio State, we had an environmental chamber. And so we were able to do some studies looking at rehydration beverages where, we'd move a bike into the environmental chamber, crank up the heat and humidity, do things like that. So I know my way around a freezing point osmometer. I can go with the best of them. But no, I mean, usually what we tend to find, like for me personally, I've had little kind of spurts where I've done a substantial amount of endurance type exercise in hot, humid climates. And for me, it's usually just not screwing it up. It is kind of how hydration works, right? So thirst gets you to a certain point, maybe going a bit beyond where thirst would put you initially, just to kind of make sure you have some reserves, make sure you have plenty. Because, I mean, Helms, it's worth noting the people that you talked about in this study who just show up at the gym, half of them are dehydrated. I bet half of them didn't go in there completely parched and, pushing each other over trying to get to the water fountain. These are people who drank to thirst or were maybe modestly thirsty, but not to the point where they were just absolutely miserable about it, right? So it's probably a good idea, if you're going to be doing exercise in the heat, to go a little beyond that, but not dramatically beyond
Yeah.
it, right? So if you're going to go dramatically beyond it, that's where you have to start saying, okay, is my diet super high in electrolytes? You could talk about having a Gatorade here or there, but the vast majority of the electrolytes that you're going to have on a daily basis are coming from your food, right? So like, I mean, how many bodybuilders have you seen, Helms, that have like 7 grams of sodium a day, right? And they're not out there trying to get it in with Gatorade and all. It just happens. It's in the diet. And then, hopefully they have adequate. Most people, the big issue when it comes to electrolyte balance is, I mean, you're getting sodium everywhere you look in modern diets. Potassium, you have to actually kind of be seeking it out, eating a pretty nutritious, relatively vegetable and or fruit heavy diet. But yeah, most people that are doing great with their potassium are eating plenty of vegetables.
Mm.
Um, but all that is to say, usually, most people are getting plenty of electrolytes from their diet. And so when they're doing a little bit of exercise here and there, not doing ultra marathon stuff in the heat, then it's really just about getting your fluid intake up a little bit. But when we see like hyponatremia or hypokalemia, which is when you kind of wash out and have clinical symptoms because you've essentially diluted your pool of potassium in your body. When we see those things happening, it's usually in like kind of freak occurrences, right? So
Yeah.
like a lot of times it'll be like a first time marathoner and the temperature was 10 degrees hotter than they expected, and they kind of freak out about it. And they know enough to know they need to drink a lot, but they don't know enough to know how much is clearly way more than they need. And they don't know enough to know they should be mixing in some electrolyte beverages as well. So you'll hear about the kind of first time marathoner who decided they were going to drink like multiple gallon, 2 or 3 gallons a day for the 2 days leading up to it, sometimes even more. And then the morning of, just pure water, as much as they could get down. So it's kind of people who are really taking an aggressive approach that unfortunately is pretty misguided, but very extreme in nature. The other time that you'll see this kind of thing is honestly in like wacky little radio station contests where they
Yeah,
say like,
that's where there was a death that got reported that kind of put it on the
yeah,
radar.
yeah, so weird little contests where it's like whoever drinks the most water over a given time frame, wins a new car or tickets to the concert in town or something like that. And that's where people are just, way over hydrating with water. There's no electrolytes in it, and they can get pretty nasty pretty quickly with really aggressive volumes of water. So
Yeah.
all of that is to say, when you talk to like when I was at Ohio State doing my undergrad, uh, Helms, a lot of departments, they kind of have a vibe. And you've like exercise science departments, you got your lifting focused departments, and you've got your endurance focused departments. At the time, believe it or not, Ohio State was a very endurance focused program. Now, years later, they get in Bill Kramer, and all of a sudden they've got the world's strongest, the Arnold Classic strongmen coming in for testing, and it just did a complete 180.
Mm-hmm.
But back then, all the grad students were like ultra marathoners. They'd do 100-mile races, the whole deal. And if you ask them what they were doing for their hydration, it wasn't, they did not have ultra meticulous, super neurotic protocols that are, down to the, and we're talking about PhD students who
Yeah.
almost by definition, you're a PhD student, you study exercise, you're doing an exercise event. If you're going to be like over neurotic about something, it should be that. And even they were like, listen, I'm going to get plenty hydrated. I might mix in a Gatorade or two. And when I'm on the trail, here's where they would get a little tricky. They would say, I need sodium and potassium. Correct. I need some fluid, but I don't want to be uncomfortable just taking in copious amounts of fluid, and I need carbohydrate. So what they would do is they would take soda and they would flatten it out. So
Mm-hmm.
basically leave it open for a day so all the carbonation kind of works its way out. And then they would just drink flat soda, which was like, because like a Gatorade's not necessarily going to have high enough concentrations, especially of like carbohydrate for them. and they don't want to be, drinking so much fluid that it's just like, they want more concentrated calories when they're out there doing a 100-mile race. So all that is to say, like, it the guidance for people who are trying to just make sure they're hydrated is keep it simple and don't do anything too wacky. But I will say, for the person that asked the question, what I would encourage you to do, most of the time when people bring this question up, I feel like maybe I'm drinking too much water. I'm feeling, lethargic, brain fog, that kind of stuff related to overhydration. I try to ask a couple questions. First of all, how much water are you drinking? And if we're talking, upwards of 6 liters of water a day, reduce it. Like there's, I mean, I would talk to them about your climate and exercise levels, but like, dude, I'm telling you, like, I've done water turnover testing with doubly labeled water. And if you're not a 260-pound athlete who runs 35 miles a week, you probably aren't turning over 8 liters of water a day or 9 liters of water a day.
Trex, one thing I will say, and sorry to interrupt, but this is
Yeah.
actually something that is, I didn't remember it before, but something that does get reported relatively frequently by weightlifters and powerlifters who are making weight, because it's very popular now to do water loading. And we actually have data now. If you check out the dissertation work, the PhD work by Reed Reel when he was part of AIS, great research where he actually compared water loading versus water restriction. And you do get another, 1 to 2 pounds of weight loss out of that protocol, comparatively in an absolute sense. And the typical thing people are doing is they're consuming 4 to 5 times their normal water intake and then cutting it all the way down the day prior to their weigh-ins. And this is also during a time period where you're doing your final training sessions, which are low volume, but they're still relatively high intensity. And there's nothing worse than feeling a little mild hyponatremia and walking out something like 200 kilos out of a squat rack. And I think a mistake that some powerlifters do is they think that, or weightlifters, they think that they can't mess with their electrolytes during this process. And you probably can. If you kind of think about the whole reason you're feeling that way is because you're actually quite low in them. So do salt your food if you start to feel that way. You're probably also doing a gut cut, so some of the foods you're eating are going to be a little different than normal. It might be a little weird. But one of the things that I like to do, for example, when I do a gut cut, is I will consume a lot of chocolate, as it's high energy density. It has fat and carbs, and then I just have like whey protein on top of that as a way to kind of meet the requirements of a high energy density, similar macronutrient composition to my normal diet, but with very low fiber, is I will specifically get like salted caramel chocolate because it increases my sodium intake a little bit and it's delicious and I'm able to consume a lot of it because you do get a little bit of burnout on that type of intake while I'm doing the water cut. And that does a pretty good job, I've noticed, the water loading of preventing some of those symptoms. So that's just one minor thing. Don't be afraid to kind of make up for some of those, some of that sodium loss that you might be having because of you artificially increasing your water intake. Because anyone who's done water loading, they're constantly peeing. And that's one of the big complaints as well. It can disrupt sleep. So if you are artificially making your water turnover way higher than it can be, and you can't follow Trex's advice of just drink less water because you're trying to do a water loading phase, you can compensate by trying to increase the sodium in your diet a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, great addition. And by the way, gut cut, basically what you're talking about is a low residue diet, basically. So you're clearing out kind of all the stuff in your gut. What's a more eloquent way to put that? You're trying to basically reduce the bulk content within your GI tract and just kind of empty out your GI tract. That sounds way worse than it is when you put it that way.
It's a low fiber, high energy density diet, so that your gut content's way less on game day.
Yeah, that sounds better.
You got less poop in the tubes, Trex. How about that?
Yes, perfect. But yeah, so I do want to say this though. When someone comes with me comes at me with these types of symptoms, like I said, first thing I'll do is check, is your water intake reasonably appropriate based on the type of physical activity you do, what kind of work you do for a living, your climate, things like that. A lot of times there's overconsumption of water. Another thing I take a look at, though, is, especially in the fitness world, do you eat a very atypical diet? The reality is a lot of people who are like power consumers of fitness content, these folks do not eat your kind of run-of-the-mill average diet. And so sometimes you will actually find a diet that is like, I eat unseasoned chicken breast and veggies. That is what I eat. And it's like, you will find the unicorns out there who actually aren't getting a decent amount of sodium in their diet. Normally, to find that, you have to look at folks who are very aggressively pursuing a DASH type diet because their physician told them to do it as part of like a management strategy for hypertension. But yeah, I look for overconsumption of fluid, and I look for atypical eating patterns that may actually have relatively low electrolytes, and usually one of those two things will start to show some pretty stark deviations from the norm, where we can say, oh, okay, here seems to be what the problem is. Either brother, you work a sedentary indoor job, you lift weights for 60 minutes, 5 days a week. We don't need 2 gallons of water a day. Or, hey, why don't we season that chicken? You're going to like it more, and it's going to be better for you in terms of kind of, making sure your electrolyte levels are a little bit higher. So that's usually is what the doctor ordered, metaphorically, because I am not a medical doctor.
No. And last thing I'll say on the hydration, just to kind of close the loop, because we talked about overhydration and hyponatremia, and we've also talked about how, unfortunately, thirst may not be a sufficient autoregulatory tool that makes people sufficiently hydrated.
It'll keep you alive.
It will. It is sufficient for life. Perhaps not sufficient for maximal adaptations in the gym based upon the data we've got. Is okay. Well, you probably don't have access to bioelectrical impedance. You probably don't have access to USG. You probably don't want to check blood plasma concentration. But what you can do is look at actually your urine color, and you just Google urine color chart, hydration status, and they've actually done some validation work to where I would say for field-specific uses with a reasonable level of validity and reliability, being in the 1 to 3 range typically in the published hydration charts, which essentially looks like almost clear but with a little bit of a yellow hint to mostly clear with a little more yellow. That's where you want to be in the majority of your urinations. And if you are darker than that first thing in the morning, but you're clear the rest of the day, that's totally fine. And the only caveat I would say, again, because we're speaking to people who have those atypical diets like you described, if you're taking like a animal pack multivitamin mix or just a bunch of especially water-soluble vitamins, you will notice that can alter your urine color, typically not making it, I wouldn't say darker, but like more neon yellow, and it's very hard.
Well, it's radioactive.
It does. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like Mountain Dew. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that, so you kind of have to be aware that if you are doing that, urinations in close proximity to when you've consumed, those vitamins are going to get thrown off a little bit. But anyway, if that's not you, then that is probably the best autoregulatory tool, because you could imagine the same body weight person in 2 very different climates and genetic differences in sweat rate, training maybe in a air-conditioned gym versus not. They need vastly different amounts of fluids. So, yeah.
Yeah. And I will say, now that I'm a doubly labeled water researcher, I've become a bit of a urine connoisseur. So in addition to what you mentioned with vitamins, of course,
beetroot
is going to turn your urine red. Do not panic. No need for alarm. Also, a lesser known one, diindolyl methane, DIM, is a supplement that a lot of folks use if they're trying to do kind of the supplement route for managing, maybe they're having some low test, high estrogen type symptoms. So not worth a deep dive into the efficacy of DIM for those applications, but that's where a lot of people use it. And it actually turns your urine kind of like tea colored. So that's something I've observed in the research world, where at first you're like, brother, you have rhabdo in a big way. But yeah, before you freak out about urine color, make sure you do some Googling, because there's actually a lot more stuff out there than you think that can meaningfully change the color of your urine, and will for at least for at least 15 minutes make you believe that you're in very serious peril. So hopefully you're not,
Experience
is
that
what
with
I'm saying.
beets, which are a big
Yeah.
part of the cuisine here in New Zealand multiple times. And they can also color your stool. So,
Hmm.
yeah, that is also something you don't want to have the color of blood in. So there's been many times where I've used the toilet, freaked out, called my wife over, forced her to look at things she would prefer not to. And then she was
Oh
like,
God.
we had beets last night for dinner. I'm like,
Why didn't
that's
you
right.
start with that? That's her fault.
Yeah. I,
Yeah.
I agree.
All right. Helms, if you want to look in the Iron Culture chat and see if there's any good questions, I want to throw one out here and kind of tee myself up and screw up for the fences. Uh, as always, thanks in advance for the excellent questions that always come in when we do these live episodes. We appreciate you for being part of the show. We had another after hours question from Jomar. And the question is, are vitamin C and gelatin worth the hype? Um, Very good question. One that comes up a lot. This is something that we've covered in mass on multiple occasions. And, we've even had a guest article on this. And I, when we have guest articles, I think I'm going to be congratulatory to our team. I think we do a good job of being rigorous without editorializing. You know what I mean? So like if we bring in an expert to write about something, we trust them to be an expert and write about it. And if there's something where we feel that there's legitimate literature to challenge a claim or an element of the article, we won't be shy about pointing that out. But we don't say like, here's the official mass company line on collagen or gelatin or fill in the blank. Make sure that your article is fully compatible with this, right? So I say that just to say I'm going to present my view, which has been present in my articles about vitamin C, gelatin, and collagen, which is kind of a related. Gelatin and collagen are quite similar in terms of how people use them, composition, etc. So what I generally tell people is, if you are taking these presumably because you want to have some kind of positive effect on the turnover, restoration, composition, etc., of a collagen-rich tissue. That's usually why people are asking these questions, right? So gelatin and collagen have very unique amino acid mixtures that theoretically, you should be able to consume them and have all the amino acids needed to produce your own collagen from those constituent amino acids. Vitamin C is actually a fully necessary precursor for endogenous collagen synthesis. So a lot of times people will say like, oh, I've got like a tendon or, some kind of connective tissue thing. I'd like to do what I can to support it. Maybe I'll do vitamin C and gelatin or vitamin C and collagen. From the literature I've seen, I'm not really convinced that those are going to make a huge impact. The literature is super hit or miss. So you will find knowledgeable people out there who say, but what about this study, which seemed to show benefit? Or what about this study? So those studies are out there. They're not, in my opinion, what you would call a consensus in the literature saying, oh yeah, these are great. What I tend to find is looking at the literature, the best thing you could do for kind of especially if we're talking a rehab setting for connective tissue injury, is load as appropriate. And what that means is there's going to be a phase where any good clinician is going to say, leave that thing alone, let it heal. And then there's going to be a phase where, light stimulation within very, specific parameters for rehabilitative type work, those are going to do more for you than any kind of nutritional mixture you throw into the mix. I mean, you have to rebuild that tissue via stimulus rather than just via input. Having said that, you want to make sure you have all the things you need to build collagen, you're going to have to resynthesize plenty of collagen protein as this tissue is kind of, building itself back up, so to speak. But from the literature I've seen, you should do pretty fine by just having a well-balanced diet with plenty of protein and vitamin C. You don't need to do the 1,000 milligram vitamin C emergency cold and flu beverage. Just a normal amount of vitamin C should be plenty. If you really wanted to hedge your bets and make sure you had everything you needed, generally speaking, it seems like the real rate limiting amino acid you'd be shooting for is actually probably glycine. I think you could make a pretty good case that glycine supplementation is just as advisable, if not more advisable, than gelatin or collagen for these types of applications. And a nice benefit is that glycine tends to be pretty affordable. It tends to mix a lot better, because gelatin and collagen have these super weird. I mean, that's the whole point of gelatin is to have really weird protein structure that gives it this wacky texture. Mm-hmm. And it's not good for putting into a shake and, spin it around with a spoon and getting a nice, delicious, smooth beverage. That's not what gelatin is for. Watch the Great British Baking Show. You're going to see gelatin is a fickle beast to work with in the baking world because of its weird textural elements. So all of that is to say the glycine is probably going to go down smoother. It's probably, going to be cheaper, I would venture to say, and should be every bit as effective. So I'm not a big gelatin or collagen guy. Vitamin C, you need it. That's why they call it a vitamin, but you don't need to go crazy with it. Helms, do you find anything good in there?
Yeah, I do. There's a couple of questions we got. Also, if you're a vegetarian or vegan, you can find glycine much more easily than you can gelatin or collagen in a form you can
good call.
Diet.
What do they have vegan gelatin?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Most of the time what you see is beef sources for the collagen.
Right.
I believe if you look at the vegetarian stuff, there are typically it's isolated amino acids. That is not a firm statement. I would need to do some Googling to make sure.
Yeah, we'll get our top people on it.
Exactly. So we do have some good questions. One of them kind of relates to what we talked about. So I'm going to go out of order because I think it is actually ideal. Eddie noted how every supplement they take, as well as the cereal and their multivitamin, is fortified with multivitamins or has it added. And they also eat plenty of vegetables. So is there such a thing as too much when it comes to micronutrients? And going back to our discussion on hydration, I was discussing how multivitamins can change urine color. And that's specifically because vitamins themselves come in two classes. We have water and fat-soluble vitamins. So all day, everyday knowledge. That's how I remember A, D, E, and K. That's the mnemonic. Those are our fat-soluble vitamins. And you've probably maybe heard of the clinical situations where your doc can be like, hey, I'm just going to give you this one big bolus of vitamin D because you're deficient, and that's fine. And that's because of the way that it's transported and stored. You might have even heard of people who used to smoke cannabis or marijuana, and they lose weight or they go through a marathon and they get not just your normal runner's high, but a little extra high. And that is presumably from some of that THC being stored in fat tissue and released. Similar concept that you are actually storing some of these fat-soluble vitamins in adipose tissue, and they can be released on a kind of quote-unquote as-needed basis. Double-edged sword there. That means that fat-soluble vitamins can build up to toxic levels if you overdo them much more easily than your quote-unquote water-soluble vitamins. So double-edged sword as well for water-soluble vitamins, which are all of your B vitamins as well as vitamin C, is that it's much harder to take in a toxic level, not impossible, of water-soluble vitamins. But at the same time, it means you kind of have to think about them on a more day-to-day basis. If you are consuming enough vitamin C and B vitamins only on one day a week, you could presumably run into problems. So the short answer is yes, you can get too much micronutrients and too much vitamins. And if you were just to do some Googling, you can see that most vitamins have tolerable upper level limits or some type of established too much or at least some type of established appropriate intake. And there are consequences if you are super high in vitamins, but it's less of a concern for the water soluble and more of a concern for the fat soluble. But it is absolutely possible to be taking in too much. As far as what to do about that, Eddie, I would say if you are taking a multivitamin, it might be worth considering doing something like a children's chewable, like one a day, kind of bare minimum
Fred
multivitamin.
Flintstone.
Yes, Fred Flintstone always tastes great. Or even potentially thinking about switching to a protein shake or a cereal if you're taking a multivitamin that isn't fortified, because it may be overdoing it. And if you're really concerned, you can always get blood work done. And you can speak to your doctor about that. And again, this is not medical advice, to see if any of your markers are higher than they should be for any of these things. Trex, anything else you want to add to that?
I would just note that everything you just said is fake. No, I would say the only thing I would add is just look out for weird stuff. So like the therapeutic window is kind of a pharmacology term, which basically means what is a gap or how big is the gap between like the dose that gets the job done and the dose that hurts you. And so for a drug, you want to have a huge therapeutic window so that we could say, yeah, we'll give you this much and it'll be good for you. But if if we accidentally go a little bit over, no harm done because we have this huge buffer zone. And so with micronutrients, generally speaking, we're talking about a very generous therapeutic window. So I don't want people to feel worried that it's like, well, wait a minute, my Fruit Loops are fortified and my milk is A&D fortified. I may get as high as 120% of what I'm supposed to get. We've got plenty of margin to play with there. But generally speaking, what you want to do is keep an eye on the fat soluble stuff and make sure that you don't have any specifically like ultra high, like look out for any wacky supplements that might be giving you like mega doses of fat soluble vitamins. Keep an eye on that. Keep an eye on any animal-based food sources that may have extremely high fat-soluble vitamin concentration. So, for example, if you're eating a lot of liver, that's something to keep in mind as well. So, frankly, if you're on like a very plant-heavy diet, without any of those like without any meat products or animal-based products that are really high in fat-soluble vitamins, you got to go pretty far out of your way, just because with a lot of plant-based foods, the micronutrient value you see on the label is not what your body's actually going to get from it because the bioavailability tends to be lower. And in some cases, Helms, fill in the blanks for me here because it's been a minute since I took a clinically oriented nutrition class, but I believe if memory serves that like with vitamin A, if you're getting all your vitamin A from plant sources, and you like try to get an absolutely tremendous amount in, won't your body just stop converting it beyond a certain level?
That sounds right. And I do recall something like that. I think as a general rule, it is.
But that does not apply to supplements.
Correct.
It doesn't apply to animal based. So all I'm saying is, Helms, everything you said was right. The responsible, appropriate thing is to keep an eye out for those things. Get tested if you have any concerns. Avoid any egregious overages. But I just want to, you're really playing the role of the alarmist today. You opened the show with, did you know that you're killing yourself every day by not being hydrated enough and you don't even know it? And think of all these dangers within your household. And then you ended with the, and by the way, your vitamins are killing you too. So I'm just trying to say, hey, we got a lot of margin to play with, but it is worth looking out for, especially with fat soluble.
Yep. Good stuff. Yeah, I got nothing to add there. We got, this is the thing that drives me bonkers, how, for some reason, one thing gets repeated that sounds scientific, typically by a specific set of content creators who are not fans of actual evidence, but more so speculation based upon mechanisms, and then they just kind of run with it. Specific question. As we all know by now, eccentrics are a complete waste of time and are pure concentrated fatigue. Why haven't we created concentric only movements? And then Kaylin said later in response to someone else who was like, wait, what? Then you're fortunate to not be on that side of social media. There has been a big trending claim that eccentric contractions essentially don't grow muscle and only contribute to fatigue. So I appreciate Kaylin is aware that that claim is perhaps overblown. And not only overblown, it is verifiably and very easily to completely say, no, that is not only wrong, it is, if anything, like the exact opposite of what's true.
I was going to say, like, it used to be back in the day, people were saying, why do we even bother with concentrics? The eccentric part is what's doing all the good stuff.
Yep. So I don't follow people who make me angry and less intelligent, so I don't know the specific claims. But I can tell you, and I just quickly looked this up because I was aware of a bunch of the eccentric reviews that came out circa 2019 and earlier, and eventually you stop wanting to read the same thing, get reported time and time again in the same way since 1980, since we've had isokinetic dynamometers. But it's actually really easy in a lab-based setting to compare concentric only versus eccentric only training using an isokinetic dynamometer. So the most recent meta-analysis I was able to find, published in the Journal of Strength Conditioning and Research by De Silva and colleagues, and as the good Dr. Trexler has done an excellent job campaigning for, you really do need to look into the methods of a meta-analysis to make sure that it's up to snuff. So with that caveat out of the way, I will simply say that while I am only looking at the principal findings and not the statistical analysis, this is a meta-analysis of 682 participants across 26 studies that met the criteria, and the main findings were no statistical difference in eccentric versus concentric on hypertrophy movements, and the sub-analysis looking at the upper limb muscles actually favored the eccentric for having greater degrees of muscle thickness. So that is verifiably false, and there is no reason to believe that. However, it is true that the eccentric component generally does create more muscle damage. So if someone has extrapolated all the way off the branch and fallen off a cliff, that's at least one part that is true, is that if you perform a similar volume or effort of eccentric versus concentric contractions, you will get more muscle damage. But
can I be honest for a second?
Yes.
This is not really useful content, but sometimes when I hear about this kind of stuff, and like you said, you made it, it made you a bit frustrated, if not angry, when people kind of take these things and just extrapolate and frankly get to the point of extrapolation where it's just speculating at that point. There's like a granule of some evidence that exists
Can
somewhere.
you call it speculation when you're actually saying the opposite of what has been proven in meta-analyses going back for 3 decades? Or are you just wrong at that point? You're not speculating.
Well, you're speculating about a thing that you don't know. So as far as you know, that work doesn't exist. Or you've found a way to write it off somehow. But, where you feel frustration, I honestly I feel this really weird mix of emotions. But this is just Eric's therapy session tonight.
Okay.
I feel like where you are meeting that with frustration or anger, I feel a mixture of, I would call it nostalgia and envy. Because I remember getting into, when I was going to do an undergrad in exercise science, I was way less cynical than I am now. And I didn't have to carry the burden of when you make a claim that is supposed to be evidence-based, it actually has to stand up to the totality of the evidence, or at least the consensus of the evidence. I remember when I viewed the world through an airport pop psychology book lens, where you found a fun little ditty that was an online survey with 18 people. And you're like, oh, now we know how the human psyche works. And that was a whole chapter in your pop psychology book. I remember seeing science as this fun little quirky endeavor that didn't come with all the baggage of being right and being rigorous. And I honestly, it sounds like a joke, and I guess there's it's 1% facetious, but I do kind of miss the naive worldview of just finding one little granule of an idea and saying, oh, cool, I'll science my way through this based on just what I feel like and what makes sense to me.
You know what? That doesn't bother me as much though. And I'll tell you why. Like and I think it is fundamentally different because I've found a little piece of pop psychology that got re-reported by the media, or maybe I'm only aware of this one little study, or hey, if we go back 15 years when we first started getting in the game, that's all there actually is, you know?
Yeah.
And we over extrapolate on it because it's like this cool toy we found, and we're not yet aware of the issues with having one small sample size study that was done with questionable methods and basing everything on that. But those are very honest mistakes.
Yeah.
This is an example of someone who is promoting content which is heavily based in mechanistic theory of muscle physiology, and they know enough that they should know better, and willfully saying epistemically, you know, I don't actually want to look at training studies because of my current belief of the way that muscle adapts. And the few studies that I've decided to accept to inform that belief, and just being like, you know, empiricism, you know, so.
Yeah. Well, no, it's such a safe, it is intellectually, the metaphor I would use is it is the big, comfortable, safe, warm bed on the cold, rainy day of doing science, where it's like, if I just stick with what I believe ought to happen and never check what does happen, then I get to live in this insulated, comfy, warm, dry world where I'm cozy in my bed and all my ideas make sense to me. And I don't have to go out into that cold, disgusting storm of all this data coming and saying that, but that's not how it works. So yeah, I envy the comfort that comes with just being able to essentially delude yourself into that safety net. That seems like a fun and nice, cozy place to live. Because the actual mess of science out there is way less fun to navigate.
Well, I think we've worked through our issues now. Maybe we can answer some more questions. What do you think?
Yeah.
I got some, or we can, unless you got any.
The only, let's see. We said we were only going to go an hour, so maybe why don't you pick one or two more from the Iron Culture chat? I'll pick one from the mass chat, and then we'll call it a night. What do you think?
Sounds good. You want to go first or me?
You go first.
Okay, cool. So this one I think we can speak about. What do you make of HRV and resting heart rate to help gauge recovery? And does training further away from failure boost recovery while also allowing you to increase volume over time without impacting gains? So a couple separate questions. The first one, HRV is a really interesting measure. For those who don't know, that's heart rate variance, and that is specifically how much variability there is in the time between heartbeats. So you can have the same heart rate of, say, 60 beats per minute, but you can have a greater or lesser degree of variability. And there's actually a fair amount of research that indicates that somewhat represents your sympathetic versus parasympathetic tone, which can be related to kind of your overall nervous system recovery. The downside, though, for this audience specifically on Iron Culture is that really super variable as to whether or not that seems to be predictive of any type of performance that we're interested in. And the reliability and the validity of heart rate variability data seems to be very dependent upon how and when you take it. So a seated measure, a lying down measure, a standing measure, a measure first thing in the morning after time of sleeping, or a peri-workout measure can't be conflated. And then depends on what you want to do with the metric. I'll be very practical here because most people are probably getting some heart rate variability data off of like their Fitbit, and now they lift and they go, oh, can I use this? I think it probably does tell you broadly what your overall recovery is, but I don't think it actually predicts or is reliable enough or useful enough, it's not valid enough really, to tell you what you should do in the gym. There are studies that have shown superior outcomes for endurance training protocols that are autoregulated using HRV. And autoregulation is not something that makes training done for you. It doesn't make it brain dead. You still have to make a decision based upon the data you have, and you can make poor decisions based upon that. You can take two different coaches with different fundamental beliefs about what you're supposed to do when you're fatigued, and they'll make opposite decisions based upon the same biofeedback data. Oh, I want to build grit and resilience. You're fatigued. Let's get a session in. Oh, I'm really, really concerned about fatigue. You're fatigued. Let's take the day off, even though we had a planned training session. There's obviously going to produce different outcomes. So HRV, I would say generally not that useful for lifting purposes, potentially useful and outside of my scope for endurance training. The second question, Vedant, is related to training to failure and recovery. This is another one of those things that I see promoted a lot. There's currently a really big concern about fatigue. And again, this comes down to this perspective of looking at mechanisms rather than actual empirical outcomes, when you should be looking at both. And some people will say only train in the 5 to 8 rep range with a 1 to 2 RIR and don't do more than 8 sets per week. And the idea here is that you're trying to mitigate all possible sources of fatigue, because fatigue is this boogeyman that is killing everyone's gains. Yet that completely does not match with any of our empirical data when we look at higher volumes or training closer to failure, or, frankly, the anecdotal experiences of bodybuilders who typically train as hard as they possibly can, with some camps being a little more volume or failure-centric. But the reality is that most bodybuilders train with what the general person would describe, or compared to these guidelines, with high volume and high intensity. And guess what happens? They mess around and get big, not accidentally make fatigue be this runaway cascade that prevents all gains. So if fatigue really was such a boogeyman, the meta-regression we have that on over 1,600 people looking at the relationship between proximity to failure and hypertrophy, which is generally using higher volumes than the specific camp of people who say you need to train at a 1 to 2 IR because of the fatigue boogeyman recommend, it would not show a relationship to where the closer you got to failure, the more hypertrophy you got. Same thing with the meta-regression over 1,000 people we have on volume. Again, if it was true that volume created this long-term issue, and I won't rehash the entire podcast we had with Pellin, the lead author on that meta-regression preprint, we would not see a relationship, granted with substantial diminishing returns, where more volume was related to more hypertrophy. So fatigue is an issue only if there's a substantial amount of fatigue. And I think the current problem with this mindset is that it is true that if you were to do a high rep set versus a low rep set to failure, you will see more markers of fatigue be elevated after high reps. It is true if you train to failure versus not, you will see more markers of fatigue. And it is true that if you do more volume than less, you will get more markers of fatigue. But it doesn't matter unless it matters. It is also true that if I go to the beach and I take a glass and I put it in the water and I take it out, I can say there is less water in the Pacific Ocean, but it absolutely does not matter. And fatigue is only a bottleneck to your performance and your adaptation if it is a bottleneck to your performance and your adaptation. And you can tell that by whether or not you're able to make measurable progress in the gym, and if you're actually seeing markers of being able to recover session to session and improve over time. And if you are, guess what? That is the definition of fatigue and recovery in sports science. Can you match or improve your prior performance? Then you are recovered, regardless of how much volume, how close to failure you're training, or whether you're doing eccentrics, or whether you're training past 8 reps, or doing less than 1 RIR. So people need to stop being so goddamn afraid of fatigue, Trex. Train harder.
All right. Yeah. And folks, you heard it. Helms said that the amount of water in the ocean doesn't matter. He's not worried about rising sea levels, regardless of the human toll that it may take.
Alleged human toll, from what
correct.
I've heard. Yeah.
Yes. All right. Very quick one. Someone asked, how do you guys track reps for unilateral exercises? Do you match reps if it differs between limbs 1 or 2? I don't worry about it. I try to think with my training, how many reps do I want to do over the next 2 years on lateral raises? You know, it's going to get lost in the wash. I give a good earnest effort. If I have any like I've never had a massive enough discrepancy from limb to, caught myself. I've never had a massive enough discrepancy that I bothered to worry about it or do any kind of intervention. Usually my thought process is I'm going to train my right arm and my left arm very hard over a long period of time, and I'm going to get whatever gains I'm going to get. They will be slightly different from one another because humans generally aren't symmetrical, but it'll be close enough to get the job done. The other question here is, do you think there's a benefit to mixing cardio modalities to mitigate the interference effect? So instead of 60 minutes of rowing, maybe you do 20 of rowing, 20 of cycling, 20 of jogging. On a purely like theoretical or mechanistic level, I would say this probably does make sense. That there is evidence to suggest that the interference effect is kind of a localized phenomenon. In the sense that if you're doing a ton of lower body cardio and a ton of lower body lifting, the lower body cardio is not going to totally rob you of bench press gains. It's more likely to interfere with, the lower body stuff. However, having said that, you can refer to several episodes we've done, I'm sure at this point, on the interference effect. But it's really important to recognize, I would say, two things. First of all, it generally takes a lot of cardio to induce a meaningful interference effect. Frankly, it's at the point where you probably wouldn't call it cardio anymore. You would probably call it either I have a extremely, extremely high level of activity every day for something that's not intentional cardio, or you're calling it my endurance sport that I compete in is probably what you're calling it, more so than your cardio that you sneak in the morning or after your lift. So that's the one thing. Usually to see substantial interference, we're talking about very, very substantial amounts of non-lifting physical activity. The other thing, which is, in my opinion, maybe even more important, is that the interference effect does not affect every type of resistance training adaptation equally. Sometimes we have a tendency to lump in resistance training adaptations as if it's a thing. But it's, in the case of the interference effect, there's really good meta-analyses breaking that down into power adaptations, strength adaptations, and hypertrophy adaptations. And we see by far the biggest interference effects of cardio on power outcomes. A dramatically lower magnitude of effect on strength outcomes, and another pretty dramatic gap where we find that most of the literature that has been used to assess the effects of cardio, these interference effects with concurrent training, we generally find an effect size for hypertrophy that's pretty close to zero. That doesn't mean that you cannot find a way to mess up or to interfere with your hypertrophy adaptations if you are really trying to. But what it means is that within the parameters, within the spectrum of resistance training programs and cardio programs that have been thrown at this question, whatever you're going to do to cause dramatic interference with your hypertrophy has to be definitely on the furthest extreme end of throwing a ton at it. So a lot of folks, especially just because of Helms, you and I were into the whole bodybuilding side of the world. You've worn every hat in strength and power sport, but I think our audience, and just fitness in general, a lot of questions do tend to be hypertrophy focused, muscle mass focused, physique focused. And so I think that's probably the biggest misconception, in my opinion, about the interference effect, is really just failing to separate out these different adaptations and really overestimating the effect of what I would call fairly typical amounts of cardio, and overestimating the negative potential that might have when it comes to hypertrophy outcomes.
Yeah.
And that's all I got for you, Helms.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is it's really an important thing I often remind people in the bodybuilding world is we think about doing cardio. And when we say cardio, we just mean burning calories, and we don't care about the intensity that it's at. Typically, we're just getting it done. We do minutes, and often it is very low intensity cardio. When we look at studies on the interference effect, they are actually prescribing what we described as endurance training, cardiorespiratory training meant to induce an endurance adaptation. And the fundamental basis of at least the mechanistic interference effect is that you're actually inducing cardiorespiratory adaptations that affect the muscle and actually change its phenotype to some degree to be more oxidative. So if you're not actually doing something that's inducing cardiovascular adaptations, you're not creating an effect that will interfere on the molecular level with your strength training adaptations. If you're doing so much cardio that you just get tired, that is the practical interference effect. Like, you're tired.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and that's a good point because I actually lately have been walking like a good 90 minutes every morning, but it's at like 3 miles an hour.
Yeah.
And it really drives me nuts that I in my mind, and I'm like playing my NCAA 2025 video game. I have an absolute dynasty going. Duke football is crushing it. It
Careful.
was what?
Starting to talk
Oh
about
yeah.
football, there's mandated things I have to talk about. Just be careful.
Well, okay, but all the we didn't talk about imaginary football universes where Duke has won like 6 championships in a row.
Or contact.
But anyway, it does baffle me because I'm in my head, I'm like, oh, I'm doing all this physical activity that's good for my health, which is true. You don't need to be sprinting to enjoy many of the benefits of physical activity, which I've written about at length in Mass. But brother, a flight of stairs will still catch up with me. So and I'm like, wait a minute, I did 90 minutes of what I would pretend is cardio this morning, and it's like, brother, you were walking.
Yep.
You're not getting, that doesn't scale up to every intensity you're going to encounter in real life. So yeah, definitely a good clarification by you. And since we're on college sports, since you insisted, how about Duke in the Final Four? College basketball. It's going to be quite a Final Four. And if you're out there, Helms doesn't care. But if you're like me, we're in for a treat. 4 of the 10 highest Ken Palm seasons ever, all present in the Final Four. So it's a legendary lineup of 4 teams here. All right, Helms, that's it. I got it out. I didn't dwell on it.
Powerlifting
Is it?
American Nationals are coming up in a week, folks. I'm now obligated to say that because of what Trex just did. Big showdowns. Make sure
You
you
don't.
watch.
So Ken Palm, just so you know, Ken Pomeroy has this website with advanced analytics for basketball. And so like you can look at a team and say like, okay, they lost a couple games early this season, but like their offensive and defensive efficiency numbers are off the charts. This is a very high quality basketball team. And Ken Palm this year, uh, all 8 of the teams that made the Elite 8 of the tournament were in his top 9 for the season. So like this dude doesn't miss.
He's doing
Like
well.
when you talk about nailing the metrics, and so the teams that made the Final Four this year all have like composite values in the top 10 ever of all the years of basketball that he's tracked. So all of that is to say it's a super top heavy year. There are 4 absolute monsters going into the Final Four, and I'm stoked. See, we can do sports science, right?
Yeah, it's not
That's
sports.
sports. That's sports science. Yes.
Okay, there was statistical analysis.
Yeah.
I think we'll need to have a discussion when we meet in Austin about some of these edge cases. But I'll allow
Yes.
it now.
All right, and that does it for us, folks. Thanks so much for joining us. Hopefully, we'll see you in Austin. Was that April 12th and 13th? Is that right, Helms?
The one.
All right. Well, thanks so much, everybody. Thanks for contributing your questions. Keep them coming. We appreciate you. And everyone have an absolutely fantastic week. Take care.